in the hardest season of 1347, when even the stones seemed to weep with cold, a young woman carried two impossible burdens: a child not yet born, and the weight of having nowhere to call home. Good evening, dear friend. As you settle into the warmth of your bed tonight, I invite you to journey with me back through the mists of time, to an age when winter was not merely a season but a test of the human spirit. This is a story of survival, of unexpected kindness, and of the fierce determination that burns brightest when all else grows cold. Let the cares of your day drift away like snow melting on warm hands, and allow yourself to walk beside a woman whose courage would echo through centuries, though history never bothered to remember her name. Her name was Alice, and she was 19 years old in that winter of 1347, though she felt ancient beyond her years. She had the kind of face that people often overlooked in crowded market squares, neither beautiful nor plain, but somewhere in that vast territory between, with brown hair that had once shone like polished chestnuts but now hung in dull, tangled waves beneath a threadbare hood. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were the color of autumn acorns, and they held a peculiar mixture of wariness and hope that marked her as someone who had learned hard lessons, but refused to stop believing in the possibility of dawn after the longest night. She had not always been homeless. Just 8 months earlier, Alice had lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village of Thornbury, in the green rolling hills of Gloucestershire. Her husband, Thomas, had been Thatcher's apprentice, a quiet man with gentle hands and a laugh that came easily, like water over stones. They had married in the spring when the hawthorn bloomed white as fresh milk along the hedgerows, and Alice had believed, with all the fierce certainty of youth, that happiness was something you could hold on to if you just gripped tightly enough. But happiness, she had learned, was as impossible to grasp as smoke. Thomas had died in late summer, when the barley stood golden in the fields and the air hummed with bees drunk on nectar. It wasn't anything dramatic, no battle, no dramatic fall from a roof, nothing that would make its way into any chronicle or song. Simply a fever that came on suddenly, turning his skin hot as forged metal and filling his lungs with fluid until he drowned on dry land. The village priest, Father Benedict, had come and administered the last rites, his Latin words falling like stones into water as Thomas's breathing grew shallower and shallower until it stopped altogether. Alice had been 3 months pregnant then, though she had not yet told Thomas. She'd been waiting for the quickening, for that first flutter of movement that would make it real, make it safe to speak aloud. Now she would never get to see his face light up with the news. That unspoken moment lived in her chest like a stone she would carry forever. The cottage had belonged to Thomas's master, Master Oswin, a prosperous Thatcher who owned 3 properties in the village. When Thomas died, Alice had hoped, foolishly, she now understood, that she might be allowed to stay on, perhaps taking in washing or doing mending to pay a modest rent. But Master Oswin had a nephew newly married and in need of a dwelling, and widows without family connections were easy to dismiss. She'd been given a fortnight to remove herself and her few possessions. Those possessions now amounted to very little: A woolen cloak that had been her mother's, so worn that the fabric had gone shiny in places. A small wooden comb that Thomas had carved for her during their courtship, with clumsy flowers etched along its spine. A linen shift, a spare kirtle of undyed wool, and a cooking pot with a cracked handle. Everything else had been sold to buy food during the early weeks of her displacement, when she'd still believed this situation was temporary, that something would change, that someone would help. She'd tried to find work, of course. She'd gone to every house in Thornbury, offering to do any task, no matter how menial. But an unmarried pregnant woman, for that's how they saw her now that Thomas was gone, as though his death had somehow unmarried her, was an uncomfortable presence. The Goodwives whispered that it was bad luck to harbor someone carrying such obvious misfortune. The men looked at her belly with suspicion, as if she'd gotten herself with child through some moral failing rather than being a proper widow. Only old Marjorie, who lived alone and took in washing, had given her occasional work, but Marjorie herself was poor as a church mouse, and there was barely enough work for one, let alone two. By October, when the leaves turned copper and gold, Alice had taken to sleeping in barns when she could slip in unnoticed, or in the forest when she could not. She knew the woods the way children know their mothers' faces. She'd grown up on their edges, gathering firewood and mushrooms and wild herbs with her mother, who'd had a reputation as a woman wise in the ways of plants and healing. That knowledge served her now. She knew which berries were safe to eat even after the frost touched them, knew where to find rose hips thick with seeds and flesh, knew which bark could be chewed to ease hunger pangs, and which fungi growing on oak trees could be roasted over a small fire and would fill your belly with something approaching substance. But knowledge of woodcraft could not keep out the cold, and this winter had come early and fierce. By November, frost glittered on the ground each morning like scattered diamonds, and Alice's breath plumed white in the air. By December, snow had begun to fall in earnest, and the child within her had grown heavy, making every step an effort, every movement a negotiation between her body's capabilities and her will to survive. The village of Thornbury itself was not unkind by medieval standards, but it was not generous either. It was a place of perhaps 300 souls, clustered around the stone church of St. Mary and the manor house, where Lord Aelred held court and collected his rents. Most people were tenant farmers, working the Lord's land in exchange for the right to farm small plots for themselves. There were a handful of craftsmen, the blacksmith, the miller, the baker, Master Oswin the thatcher. Everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant everyone knew Ali's situation, and everyone had made their calculations about what they could or could not afford to offer. This was the way of medieval England, where life balanced on a knife's edge between survival and starvation, even in good years. The harvest of 1347 had been adequate but not generous, and people were already nervous, hoarding what they had against the hungry months of late winter when last year's stores ran low, and this year's crops were still months from harvest. A pregnant widow with no family and no resources was simply another mouth that might eat bread someone else's child needed. There were some, a very few, who showed her small mercies. The baker's wife, Margaret, sometimes left a slightly burned loaf on the back step where Alice might find it, though she never acknowledged this charity directly. Young Edmund, the blacksmith's apprentice, once gave her a handful of roasted chestnuts when he saw her shivering near the smithy forge, though he'd blushed fierce red and hurried away before she could thank him properly. And Father Benedict, though he had no authority to offer her shelter in the church itself, sometimes allowed her to slip into the cold stone building during the day to escape the worst of the weather, kneeling in the back pew as if in prayer while really just absorbing what little warmth the space offered. But these were exceptions, bright sparks in a landscape of general indifference. Most people simply looked past her, the way you look past a beggar or a leper, seeing but not seeing, acknowledging but not engaging. It was easier that way. To truly see her suffering would require them to make a choice about whether to help, and helping carried costs they could not afford. On this particular December evening, as snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that muffled all sound and turned the world into something hushed and strange, Alice was walking the forest path between Thornbury and the neighboring hamlet of Ashfield. It was a distance of perhaps 3 miles, and she had hopes that in Ashfield, where no one knew her story, she might find better fortune. Perhaps a barn owner less vigilant about securing his doors, or a church with a more sympathetic priest. The baby kicked as she walked, a firm pressure against her ribs that made her catch her breath. The child was active now, especially in the evenings, and Alice had taken to pressing her hands against her belly when it moved, feeling the mystery of this separate life growing inside her. She talked to the baby sometimes in a low voice, telling stories about its father, about the cottage where they would have lived, about the life they would have had if fortune had been kinder. Yurda was good with his hands, she murmured now, her voice nearly lost in the snow-soft air. He could take a bundle of straw and twist it into magic, making roofs that kept out every drop of rain. Patient work thatching. You have to do it right, layer by layer, each handful of straw placed just so. He used to say that a good roof was like a good life, built carefully, one day at a time. The words helped pass the distance, helped her forget the ache in her back and the numbness creeping into her toes. She'd wrapped her feet in rags beneath her worn leather shoes, but the snow was finding its way through, turning the cloth damp and then freezing. The forest in winter was a different place from the green cathedral it became in summer. Now the trees stood bare, their branches black against the white sky, and the usual sounds, birdsong, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, were absent. Only the whisper of falling snow and her own breathing broke the silence. Alice found herself remembering childhood winters, when she'd walked these same paths holding her mother's hand, both of them bundled in shawls, their breaths mingling in the cold air. Her mother, Agnes, had died 4 years ago, succumbing to a wasting illness that had slowly stolen her strength until she was light as a bird in Alice's arms. Before she died, she'd made Alice promise to learn a trade, to never depend solely on a husband's income. Men are mortal, Agnes had said, her voice thin but firm. Skills are what keep a woman alive when fortune turns. Alice had learned herbal craft, how to make poultices and tinctures, how to ease a fever and bring down a swelling. But this knowledge had proved less valuable than her mother had hoped. The village already had Marjorie for such things, and there wasn't room for two women with healing knowledge in such a small place. The path curved around a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't have joined hands around it. Alice knew this tree well. It was a landmark, marking the halfway point between villages. Locals called it the King's Oak, though no king had ever seen it, simply because it was ancient and massive and seemed to deserve a grand name. In summer, lovers carved their initials into its bark. In autumn, children gather their acorns to roast. Now in winter, it stood sentinel over the white landscape, indifferent to human struggles. As she rounded the oak, Alice heard something that made her freeze, the sound of horses and voices coming from the direction she was heading. Her heart began to pound. Travelers on the roads could mean anything. They might be merchants or pilgrims, harmless enough. But they might also be rougher types, the kind of men who saw a lone woman as an opportunity rather than a fellow human being. Medieval roads were dangerous places, especially in winter when desperation made even ordinary people do desperate things. She quickly stepped off the path, moving as quietly as her pregnancy allowed into the deeper shadows beneath the trees. The snow was thicker here, untrampled, and she sank ankle-deep with each step, but the darkness would hide her. She pressed herself against the far side of the King's Oak, the bark rough against her back even through her cloak, and held very still. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and then a small party came into view, 3 horses, 2 riders, and a pack animal laden with goods. The riders were men, both wearing the kind of sturdy traveling cloaks that spoke of means if not wealth. As they passed her hiding spot, their voices carried clearly in the cold air. "I should have stayed in Bristol another night," one was saying, his voice carrying the accent of someone educated, perhaps a clerk or merchant. "This snow will make the going harder." And paid for another night's lodging. "No, thank you," the other replied. This one sounded older, with a voice like gravel. "We're barely 2 hours from Ashfield. We'll make it before dark if we keep steady." "If the snow doesn't worsen," the first man said doubtfully. They passed without seeing her, the horses' hooves muffled in the snow, and Alice waited until the sound had faded completely before she allowed herself to breathe normally again. Her hands were shaking from cold, from fear, from the simple strain of standing so still. She rested her forehead against the oak for a moment, feeling its solid permanence, older than memory, older than all human troubles. "It's all right," she whispered to her belly, to the child within. "We're safe. We're all right." But even as she said it, she felt the lie of it. They were not all right. They were cold and hungry and alone, and the snow was falling harder now, the flakes smaller and more determined. The kind of snow that meant business, that would pile up through the night and make the world impassable by morning. She forced herself to keep walking, but the encounter had shaken her confidence. Perhaps going to Ashfield was foolish. Perhaps she should turn back to Thornbury, try once more to find shelter there. But what shelter? She'd tried every door she dared approach. The only place left was the church, and Father Benedict, kind as he was, could not let her sleep there. The bishop had strict rules about such things, and Father Benedict had already bent those rules as far as he dared. No, forward was better than back. At least forward held the possibility of something unknown, some chance she hadn't yet exhausted. The light was fading now, that early winter dark that came well before true evening. The sky above the trees was the color of tarnished silver, and the shadows between the trees were deepening into wells of blue-black darkness. Alice knew she needed to find shelter soon. The night would be brutal, and she could not afford to be caught in the open. Her baby might be able to withstand the cold. Bobbies in the womb were well protected, but she herself was weak from weeks of poor eating and inadequate rest. If she collapsed from a cold, if she fell asleep in the snow, she might not wake up. She had just begun to scan the forest for a fallen log or a dense cluster of evergreens that might offer some wind protection when she saw it. A small curl of smoke rising above the trees, perhaps a quarter-mile off the path. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant either danger or help, and she would have to make a gamble on which. For a long moment, Alice stood in the falling snow, weighing her options. The safe choice was to avoid other people, to find what shelter she could in the forest and wait for morning. But safety was a luxury she could no longer afford. The baby kicked again, a reminder of the other life depending on her decisions. She turned off the path and began making her way through the deeper snow toward the source of the smoke. The walking was harder here, the snow undisturbed and sometimes hiding holes or roots that made her stumble. Her breath came in gasps, and she had to stop frequently to rest, leaning against trees, one hand pressed to her aching back. The baby felt impossibly heavy, pulling at her spine, making her hips ache with every step. As she drew closer, she began to make out a structure through the trees. Not a house, but something smaller. A charcoal burner's hut, perhaps, or a woodsman's shelter. The smoke was coming from a hole in the thatched roof, and as she approached, she could see a faint glow of firelight through gaps in the wattle and daub walls. She hesitated at the edge of the small clearing where the hut stood. Now that she was here, fear gripped her. Who might be inside? What if they were cruel? What if they drove her away into the worsening storm? But what choice did she have? She was so cold that her hands had lost feeling, and her feet felt like blocks of wood at the ends of her legs. Gathering what courage she could, Alice approached the hut's low door and knocked, the sound barely audible over the wind that was beginning to rise, sending snow swirling in strange patterns. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard movement inside, footsteps, and the door swung inward, spilling warm firelight into the twilight. The woman who stood in the doorway was perhaps 50 years old, with a face like weathered leather and eyes as black as sloe berries. She was small, barely reaching Alice's shoulder, but there was something formidable about her, a sense of strength contained in a compact frame. She wore a rough woolen dress and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her gray hair was bound up in a linen coif. She looked Allie's up and down, taking in the threadbare cloak, the obviously pregnant belly, the desperate look that Allie's could feel on her own face like a mask she couldn't remove. "Please," Allie's managed, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "I'm traveling to Ashfield in the snow. I just need to warm myself for a bit. I won't be in any trouble. I can pay," but even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She had nothing to pay with. The woman's expression didn't change. She continued to study Allie's with those sharp black eyes, and Allie's felt herself being assessed, weighed, judged. Then, just when Allie's was certain she would be turned away, the woman stepped back and gestured inside. "Come in then," she said, her voice rough but not unkind. "Before you freeze where you stand, and I have your ghost haunting my door all winter." Allie's nearly wept with relief. She stumbled over the threshold into the hut's single room, and the warmth hit her like a physical thing, making her skin prickle and burn as feeling began to return to her numb extremities. The hut was small and simple but blessedly warm, with a fire burning in a central hearth and a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape. There was a rough pallet in one corner, a few cooking pots hanging from hooks, a stool, and not much else. But to Allie's, it looked like paradise. "Sit," the woman commanded, pointing to the stool near the fire. "Take off those wet things before you catch your death." Allie's did as she was told, her fingers fumbling with the clasp of her cloak. The woman watched her struggle for a moment, then made an impatient sound and came over to help, her own fingers quick and sure despite their gnarled appearance. "You've come from Thornbury," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Allie's nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because I know everyone from Ashfield, and you're not from there. And you're walking that direction, so you must have come from Thornbury or somewhere beyond." "Not many places beyond." She hung Allie's cloak on a hook near the fire where it began to steam gently. "I'm Edith. This is my hut. It has been for 20 years. I make charcoal for Lord Aelred's blacksmith." "I'm Allie's," she replied, holding her hands toward the fire's warmth, feeling pins and needles as circulation returned. I was from Thornbury. Now I'm looking for work in Ashfield." Edith made a sound that might have been a laugh or a snort. "Work? In your condition," she gestured at Allie's belly. "When's the baby due?" "I think maybe 6 weeks, 7. I'm not certain. Time has become fluid lately, one hard day blending into the next." Edith ladled something from a pot that hung over the fire, something that smelled like heaven, onions, herbs, perhaps a bit of pork if Allie's wasn't imagining it. She handed the wooden bowl to Allie's, along with a heel of dark bread. "Eat. Slowly, mind you, if you haven't had much lately. Don't want you sick." Allie's took the bowl with shaking hands, and the first taste of the warm broth nearly undid her. It was simple fare, just barley and vegetables in water, but to her it was a feast. She forced herself to eat slowly as Edith had instructed, though every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. Edith settled herself on the edge of the pallet and watched Alice eat with an expression that was difficult to read. Finally, she spoke. "I'm going to tell you something, girl, because someone needs to. You won't find work in Ashfield. Or if you do, it won't be enough. Not in winter, not pregnant, not without family or connections. You know this already, don't you?" Alice did know it, had known it all along, but had been pushing the knowledge away because to acknowledge it was to acknowledge that she had no plan, no hope, no future she could see clearly. She nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "I thought so," Edith said. "You've got that look about you, someone who's still hopping but knows better. I've seen it before." She paused and seemed to consider her words carefully. "My daughter was like you once. Pregnant, husband dead. His heart stopped while he was plowing, just dropped in the field like someone cut his strings. She tried to manage alone. Proud she was. Wouldn't ask for help until it was too late." "What happened to her?" Alice asked quietly. "She died. Baby too. Caught a fever in her lying in and never recovered." Edith's voice was matter of fact, but Alice could hear the old pain beneath it, worn smooth by years but never truly gone. "That was 15 years ago. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone in the same situation, I would." Alice looked up, hardly daring to hope. Are you saying I can stay?" "For tonight, yes. Maybe a few more nights, until this snow clears and you've got your strength back." Edith held up a hand before Alice could thank her. "But I'm a charcoal burner, girl. I'm not rich. I can't feed you through the whole winter and into spring until that baby comes. I barely have enough for myself, but I can give you a few days, and in that time, maybe we can figure something out." Maybe. It was more than Alice had dared hope for, and the relief that washed through her was so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you. I'll help however I can." "Finish your soup," Edith interrupted. "We'll talk about work tomorrow. Tonight you need rest and warmth and food. Tomorrow is soon enough for plans." Alice slept that night better than she had in weeks, curled on a pile of sacking that Edith had spread near the fire, a rough blanket pulled over her. The baby settled as she settled, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell into sleep without the gnawing anxiety that had become her constant companion. The hut was warm, she was safe, and for this moment, just this moment, that was enough. She woke to gray morning light filtering through the gaps in the walls and the smell of porridge cooking over the fire. Edith was already up, moving about with the efficient economy of someone who'd lived alone for years and wasted no motion. When she saw Alice stirring, she nodded toward the pot. "There's washing water in the bucket there," she said. "Cold but clean. Porridge will be ready soon." The water was indeed cold, so cold it made Alice gasp when she splashed it on her face, but it was clean and fresh, probably melted snow, and it felt like a luxury after weeks of washing in whatever streams or puddles she could find. She used her fingers to comb through her tangled hair as best she could, wishing she had her wooden comb, but knowing it was packed away in her small bundle of possessions. They ate porridge sweetened with a tiny bit of honey, and Alice tried not to eat too quickly, trying not to think about how long it had been since she'd had 2 meals so close together. Edith watched her with those sharp black eyes, missing nothing. "You said you'd work," Edith said when they'd finished eating. "Can you tend a fire? Keep it at the right heat, not too hot, not too cool." "Yes," Alice said. "My mother taught me cooking, and I kept house for my husband. I know fires." "Charcoal burning is different from cooking fires," Edith said. "More particular. The wood has to burn slowly, with just enough air to keep it going but not enough to let it flame up. Too much air and you get ash. Too little and it goes out. It takes days, sometimes more than a week, and someone has to watch it the whole time, day and night." "I can learn," Alice said eagerly. "I'm good at learning." Edith studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Come on then. I'll show you the pit." She bundled Alice into her cloak, now dry from hanging near the fire all night, and they stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow had continued through the night, and everything was covered in white that sparkled in the weak morning light. The sky was still heavy and gray, promising more snow to come, but for now it had paused, giving the world a chance to catch its breath. Behind the hut, perhaps 50 yards into the trees, was what Edith called her pit, a circular depression in the ground, about 15 feet across, lined with stones and covered with a carefully constructed mound of earth and turf. Smoke rose from several spots around the mound, thin wisps that barely disturbed the cold air. "There's wood in there," Edith explained, pointing to the mound. "Oak mostly, some ash and beech. Been burning for 4 days now. Needs another 3, maybe 4 before it's done. You have to check it regularly, make sure the smoke stays steady. Make sure no part of it burns too hot or too cold. You see how there's smoke coming from different spots? Each of those is a vent. If one starts smoking too much, you plug it a bit with earth. If one stops smoking, you open it up more." She walked Alice around the entire circumference of the pit, showing her the telltale signs of proper burning, explaining how to read the color and thickness of the smoke, how to feel the heat radiating from different sections of the mound. It was more complex than Alice had imagined, and she found herself fascinated despite the cold. "The charcoal burner's art," Edith said, "is patience. You can't rush it. You can't force it. You have to work with the wood, with the fire, let it happen at its own pace. Some people don't have the temperament for it. They get anxious. They start poking and prodding and adjusting when they should just let it be. You seem like you might have patience, though. You'd need it to have survived what you've been through." They spent the morning tending the pit together, Edith teaching and Alice learning, asking questions, filing away information. By midday, Alice's back was aching, and her feet were cold despite the rags wrapped around them. But she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, useful, needed, like she had a purpose beyond simply surviving until tomorrow. They returned to the hut for a meal of bread and cheese, precious cheese, which Edith parceled out in small portions. As they ate, Edith asked the question Alice had been dreading. "So what's your story then?" "My husband is dead, I'm guessing." "Recently?" Alice nodded, swallowing hard. 3 months ago. 4 almost. He was Thatcher's apprentice in Thornbury. Thomas. He died of a fever. And his family. Your family. He had no family. Orphaned young, raised by the parish. My parents are both dead. My father when I was small, my mother 4 years ago. I have a brother, but he went to London to seek his fortune 2 years ago, and I haven't heard from him since. Alice traced a pattern in the crumbs on the wooden plate. I tried to stay in our cottage, but it belonged to Thomas's master, and he needed it for his nephew. I tried to find work, but nobody wants a pregnant widow, Edith finished. Not in winter, when everyone's scraping by. I know. It's the way of things. I don't understand why, Alice said, and was surprised by the anger in her own voice. I can work as hard as anyone. I'm not asking for charity, just a chance to earn my keep. But people look at me like I'm cursed, like my misfortune might rub off on them. Because you are cursed in their eyes, Edith said bluntly. Your husband died young, and you're pregnant without a man to provide for you. In a world where most people believe God's favor brings prosperity, and his disfavor brings suffering, you look like someone God has turned his face from. Superstition, but powerful. People fear what might happen if they align themselves with someone fortune has abandoned. Do you believe that? Alice asked. That God has abandoned me. Edith was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I believe God is mysterious in his ways, and I've seen too much to claim I understand them. I've seen good people suffer and wicked people prosper. I've seen bobbies die and old sinners live to ripe ages. If there's a pattern, I haven't found it. What I do know is that we're here, we're breathing, and we have choices about how we treat each other. I choose to help when I can. Not because I think it'll earn me heaven or because I'm afraid of hell, but because my daughter died alone and afraid, and I can't undo that, but I can maybe keep it from happening to someone else. The simple honesty of this statement brought tears to Alice's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, not wanting to seem weak or overly emotional, but Edith saw anyway. None of that now, she said gruffly. Save your tears for when you need them. You'll have enough cause for weeping before this winter's through, I expect. Over the next few days, a routine established itself. They rose at dawn, ate porridge, and went out to check the charcoal pit. Alice learned to read the smoke, to judge when a vent needed adjusting, to feel the subtle differences in heat that meant the wood was converting properly into charcoal. In the afternoons, while the pit did its slow work largely unsupervised, they would gather deadwood from the forest for the hut's fire, or Edith would teach Alice other useful skills. How to set snares for rabbits, how to find the best places to chip ice from the frozen stream, how to render every last bit of use from their meager supplies. Edith talked while they worked, and slowly, Alice learned her story. She'd been married once, to a woodsman named Robert who died in an accident 25 years ago, crushed by a falling tree. She'd been pregnant at the time, and the shock had nearly caused her to lose the baby, but her daughter had been born healthy, a girl she'd named Catherine after her own mother. Edith had raised Catherine alone, working as a charcoal burner, a trade she'd learned from her father. It was unusual for a woman to do such work, but Lord Aelred, who owned these woods, had been willing to let her continue as long as she produced quality charcoal and paid her annual fee. Catherine was my world, Edith said one afternoon as they walked the frozen forest paths, looking for deadfalls suitable for burning. Bright as a new penny she was. Curious about everything. She wanted to learn to read, can you imagine? A charcoal burner's daughter wanting to read. I didn't see the point of it myself, but she was determined. She'd go to the church and beg Father Benedict. Father Thomas it was then, before Benedict came to teach her letters. And he did, bless him. She could read Psalms by the time she was 10. What was she like? Alice asked, carefully stepping over a fallen log. Stubborn. Willful, kind though always kind. She'd bring home injured birds and try to nurse them. Most died, but some lived, and she'd set them free when they healed. She believed in second chances. Edith's voice grew distant. She fell in love with a farmer's son, Martin. Good boy, hard worker. They married when she was 18 and they were happy. I thought they'd have a dozen children, grow old together. But Martin's heart was weak. We didn't know it, you couldn't see it, and one day it just stopped. She was 6 months gone with their first child. The parallel to Ali's own situation was so clear it hurt. I'm sorry, she said quietly. She tried to manage alone. Proud, like I said. I offered to help, but she wanted to prove she could do it herself. And maybe she could have, if she'd stayed healthy. But bobbies take so much from you, especially when you're not eating enough, not resting enough. She went into labor early and it went badly. The midwife did what she could, but Catherine just bled and bled. She died at dawn and the baby, a boy, died an hour later. Edith stopped walking, standing very still in the snow-covered forest. I held my grandson for the only hour of his life. He was perfect, tiny but perfect, and then he just stopped breathing, like his mother, like his father. The three of them, all gone in the span of a year. Alice found herself crying, not just for Edith's losses, but for her own, for Thomas, for the precariousness of her own situation and her unborn child's future. Edith let her cry for a moment, then handed her a rough cloth to wipe her face. Life is hard, Edith said simply. It's always been hard for people like us. We're not nobles with full larders and servants. We're not even prosperous merchants with savings put by. We're the ones at the bottom, the ones who live or die based on whether the harvest was good, whether the winter is mild, whether we stay healthy. But we survive, most of us. We endure. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we find moments of grace in between the hardship. They continued walking, gathering wood, and Allie's thought about survival, about endurance, about grace. That night, as she lay by the fire in Edith's hut, she felt her baby kick and placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life there, the stubborn insistence of it. This child wanted to live, wanted to be born, wanted a chance at the world. And Allie's would give it that chance somehow, whatever it took. The charcoal pit burned on, day after day, and Allie's tended it carefully, learning its rhythms, understanding its needs. On the 6th day, Edith declared it ready, and they began the process of opening the mound, carefully, methodically, letting the heat dissipate before exposing the charcoal to air that might make it burst into flame. It took hours, working in the cold, but finally they revealed the charcoal beneath, black and light, perfect for the blacksmith's forge. "You did well," Edith said, examining a piece, breaking it to check its quality. "This is good charcoal. Clean burn, dense. You've got the knack for it." The praise warmed Allie's more than the fire. She'd done something right, learned something useful, contributed something of value. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it mattered. They spent the next day loading the charcoal into sacks, and the day after that, Edith made the journey to Thornbury to deliver it to the blacksmith, leaving Allie's alone in the hut with instructions to keep the fire going and not to answer the door to anyone. Allie spent the day resting, grateful for the respite, though she found herself anxious for Edith's return. The old woman had become a lifeline, the first real kindness Allie's had experienced in months. Edith returned at dusk, snow-covered and tired, but carrying supplies, flour, a precious bit of salt, some dried peas, and a small amount of salted pork. She also carried news. "People in Thornbury are talking about the pestilence," she said as she unpacked her bag. "There's word from Bristol that people are dying of a strange sickness. Fever, swellings in the neck and under the arms, death within days. Some say it's God's judgment. Some say it's bad air from the docks. Either way, people are afraid." Allie's felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "How many dead?" "Dozens from what I heard. Maybe more. The blacksmith's cousin works on the docks there, and he said bodies are being buried in mass graves because there's not enough time or space for individual burials." Edith's face was grim. "If it spreads to the countryside, it'll be bad. Worse than bad." Neither of them knew it then, but they were hearing the first whispers of what would later be called the Black Death, the plague that would kill perhaps a third of England's population over the next few years. In December of 1347, it was still just a rumor, a distant horror that belonged to cities and ports, not to small villages and forest clearings. But it was coming, moving inexorably across the landscape like winter itself, indifferent to human hope or prayer. That night, Allie's dreamed of Thomas for the first time in weeks. In the dream, he was alive and healthy, and they were in their cottage, and everything was as it should have been. He was laughing at something she'd said, his head thrown back, joy in every line of his face. And then she woke to darkness and the pop of the fire, and he was gone again, and the grief of it was fresh as the day he died. She lay quietly, not wanting to wake Edith, and let the tears come silently, soaking the rough fabric beneath her cheek. She missed Thomas with an ache that was physical, a hole in her chest that nothing could fill. She missed his voice, his touch, the way he'd rested his hand on the small of her back when they walked together. She missed the future they'd planned, the life they'd imagined, children growing up in that little cottage, growing old together, grandchildren someday. All of it gone, vanished like morning mist. But the baby kicked, reminding her that some part of Thomas lived on and would be born into the world in a few weeks' time. The child would never know its father, but it would exist, would breathe and grow and perhaps have children of its own someday. It was a kind of immortality, she supposed, though a bittersweet one. Morning came with more snow. By now, the drifts were high enough that walking any distance was exhausting, and Edith declared they would stay close to the hut, conserving energy, eating sparingly to stretch their supplies. They'd prepared another pit for burning, but they couldn't light it until this batch of charcoal was fully sold, and they had coin for the fee they'd need to pay the Lord's reeve for the right to cut more wood. Everything in medieval life came with fees and obligations, chains of debt and duty that bound everyone from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. They passed the time with handwork. Edith had wool that needed carding, and she showed Alice how to tease the fibers straight with wooden combs, preparing it to be spun into thread. The work was meditative, rhythmic, and Alice found her mind drifting as her hands moved. She thought about what would happen when the baby came. Edith had made it clear she couldn't stay indefinitely. The old woman barely had enough for herself, and another mouth to feed, plus eventually a crying infant, was beyond her means. Alice would need to find something else, somewhere else. But where? And how with a newborn? "You're worrying," Edith said, not looking up from her carding. "I can hear it in the way you breathe." "I'm thinking about what comes next," Alice admitted. "After the baby is born. I can't stay here forever, I know that, but I don't know where I can go." Edith was quiet for a moment, her hands continuing their steady work. "There's a convent," she said finally. "A center. Mary's about a day's walk from here, past Ashfield. They take in women sometimes, women in difficult circumstances. It's not an easy life. You'd have to work, and they'd expect you to be pious, attend all the services. But they feed you, give you shelter. And they'd care for the baby." "Would they let me keep the child?" Alice asked, her heart clenching at the thought of separation. "I don't know," Edith said honestly. "Depends on the abbess. Depends on their situation, depends on whether they have room for both or just one. But it's an option. Maybe the only option, if you want both you and the baby to survive the winter." The thought of giving up her child was unbearable, but so was the thought of the baby dying from cold or hunger, because Alice couldn't provide adequate care. It was the kind of impossible choice that medieval women faced routinely. Survival often meant sacrifice, meant giving up pieces of yourself and your life just to keep breathing. "I'll think about it," Allie said quietly. "But not yet. Not until after the baby comes." "Fair enough," Edith agreed. "Time enough to worry about tomorrow when tomorrow comes." 3 more days passed in this quiet routine. The snow continued intermittently, sometimes just flurries, sometimes heavier falls that left them trapped inside the hut for hours. Allie's belly seemed to grow larger by the day, and moving became increasingly difficult. She tired easily, needed help standing from sitting positions, and had to visit the privy pit behind the hut constantly as the baby pressed on her bladder. Edith watched her with concerned eyes but said nothing. There was nothing to say. The baby would come when it came, and they would deal with it then. On the 4th day, a visitor arrived, the first person besides themselves that Allie's had seen since arriving at the hut. She heard voices outside while she was resting in the afternoon, Edith's and a man's, and her heart began to race with familiar fear. She'd learned to associate men's voices with danger, with dismissal, with doors closing in her face. But when the door opened, Edith entered with a young man who looked barely older than Allie's herself, perhaps 22 or 23, with the kind of face that hadn't quite lost its boyish softness. He was dressed in the rough woolens of a peasant, with a leather bag slung over one shoulder and snow dusting his dark hair. "This is Peter," Edith said. "He's the Lord Reeves' assistant, making his winter rounds to check on everyone in the forest holdings. Peter, this is Allie's. She's helping me with the charcoal burning." Peter nodded politely to Allie's, though his eyes lingered on her swollen belly with the kind of curiosity he probably thought he was hiding. "Well met," he said. "I'm just making sure everyone came through the snow all right, that nobody needs help or has complaints to report to the Lord." "Everything is well here, Edith." "Well enough," Edith said. "We've been keeping busy. I've got a new batch of charcoal ready to sell as soon as the road's clear enough to haul it." "Good, good." Peter shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable in the small space with 2 women, one of them obviously pregnant. "Lord Aelred will be pleased. Good charcoal is hard to come by in winter." He glanced at Allie's again, then away. "You'll need to register your helper with the manor, Edith. Can't have unregistered people living on the Lord's land. Just a formality, but it needs doing." Allie's stomach dropped. Registration meant official notice, meant her presence here would be recorded, meant people in authority would know where she was. And that meant the possibility of being forced to move again, especially once they learned she had no husband, no family, no place she properly belonged. "I'll see to it," Edith said smoothly. "Next time I'm in Thornbury." Peter nodded, seemingly satisfied. He accepted a cup of water, made awkward small talk about the weather for a few more minutes, then departed, leaving behind a wake of anxiety that hung in the air like smoke. "Will they make me leave?" Allie's asked as soon as the door closed behind him. "Not likely," Edith said, though she didn't sound entirely certain. "You're working, not begging. And I'm vouching for you. That should be enough, at least for now. But yes, we'll need to register you properly. Pay the fee for an additional resident. It's not much, just a few pennies, but it's the law. More fees, more obligations, more chains. Alice felt the weight of them pressing down on her. She'd never thought much about the complex web of laws and customs that governed medieval life. But now that she was outside the protection of family and marriage, she felt how precarious it all was, how easily a person could fall through the cracks if they didn't fit into the neat categories society had prepared. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Edith told Alice more stories about life in the forest, about the years she'd spent alone after Catherine died, about the other charcoal burners who worked these woods, old William, who was half blind but could still judge charcoal quality by touch, young Thomas, not Alice Thomas, another Thomas, the name was common as dirt, who'd run off to join a monastery after his wife died. Anne, who'd been caught stealing wood from the Lord's forest and had her hand cut off as punishment, a maiming that had eventually led to infection and death. The stories were cautionary tales. Alice understood, warnings about the harshness of the world, the consequences of missteps, the importance of following the rules even when the rules seemed arbitrary or cruel. But they were also stories of survival, of people who'd endured despite everything, who'd carved out lives in the margins. The trick, Edith said, is to make yourself useful. If you're useful, people want to keep you around. If you're a burden, they find ways to be rid of you. That's why I taught you about charcoal burning. It's a skill not many have, and it makes you valuable. But I can't do it forever, Alice said. Not with a baby. No, Edith agreed. But maybe long enough to get through this winter. And maybe by spring, things will look different. Maybe the convent will take you. Maybe you'll find some other situation. Maybe, she hesitated, then continued, maybe you'll find another man willing to marry a widow with a child. It happens sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. The thought of marrying again hadn't even occurred to Alice. Thomas had been dead for such a short time, and the grief was still so raw. But Edith was right. Marriage was the most reliable form of security for a woman in medieval England. A husband meant protection, provision, a legitimate place in society. But finding a man willing to take on another man's child, a man who was kind rather than cruel, who would treat her decently, those were long odds. I can't think about that now, Alice said. I just need to get through one day at a time. That's the only way to do it, Edith agreed. One day at a time, one breath at a time. That's how we all survive. The next morning brought a change in the weather. The snow stopped, and weak sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in over a week. The sudden brightness was almost disorienting after so many gray days, and Alice stood outside the hut, tilting her face toward the pale sun, feeling its meager warmth on her skin like a promise. We should take advantage of the clear weather, Edith said. Go to Thornbury, sell this charcoal, register you with the manor, buy supplies. The roads will still be bad, but passable if we're careful. The thought of going back to Thornbury filled Alice with dread. She'd see people who'd turned her away, who'd looked through her as if she didn't exist. But Edith was right. It needed doing, and better to do it now while the weather allowed. They loaded the charcoal into 2 large sacks that they could carry between them, though Edith insisted on taking the heavier load, leaving Alice with the lighter one. The walk was difficult, the snow still deep in places, the path treacherous with ice beneath the snow. Alice had to stop frequently to rest, her back aching, her breath coming hard. The baby felt impossibly heavy, pulling at her spine with every step. It took them nearly 3 hours to cover the distance that would normally take less than 1. By the time Thornberry came into view, Alice was exhausted, her feet numb with cold, despite the layers of rags wrapped around them. But there it was, the village where she'd been born, where she'd married Thomas, where she'd thought she'd live out her life. Seeing it now from the perspective of exile, it looked different, smaller, less welcoming. Just a collection of buildings huddled together against the winter, smoke rising from chimneys, people going about their business, living their lives while hers had fallen apart. They went first to the blacksmith's forge, where Edith conducted her business with the smith, a burly man named Hugh who examined the charcoal carefully before nodding his approval and counting out coins into Edith's palm. Alice stood to the side, trying to be invisible, but Hugh noticed her anyway. "That's Thomas the Thatcher's widow, isn't it?" he said to Edith, as if Alice couldn't hear him. "I heard she'd left the village." "She's working for me now," Edith said firmly. "Good worker, too. Quick learner." Hugh grunted noncommittally and returned to his forge, and Alice felt a small spark of gratitude toward Edith for defending her, for claiming her as someone valuable rather than someone cursed. They visited the manor house next, where they paid the registration fee to a bored clerk who barely looked at Alice as he scratched her name into a ledger. Just like that, she was official, recorded, a person with a legal right to be where she was. It should have felt like security, but instead it just felt like another link in the chain, another way the world could track and control her. Their last stop was the market square, where a handful of vendors had set up stalls despite the cold. Edith bought flour, salt, a small amount of dried fish and precious vegetables, onions and turnips that had been kept in cold storage. She also bought, to Alice's surprise, a length of soft linen and some wool yarn. "For baby clothes," Edith explained gruffly when she saw Alice's expression. "That child will need something to wear when it comes. Can't have it naked in the cold." The kindness of it overwhelmed Alice, and she had to blink back tears. "I'll pay you back," she managed. "Somehow. I'll find a way. Just stay alive," Edith said. "That's enough payment." As they prepared to leave the market, Alice heard someone call her name. She turned to see old Marjorie, the washerwoman who'd occasionally given her work, hurrying toward them as fast as her arthritic legs would allow. "Alice, I heard you'd left the village. I've been worried about you, girl." Marjorie reached them breathless, her wrinkled face creased with concern. "Are you well? Where have you been?" "I'm working for Edith now," Alice said, gesturing to the charcoal burner. Helping with the charcoal. I'm managing. Marjorie looked her up and down, taking in the threadbare cloak, the swollen belly, the exhaustion written on Allie's face. Managing, she repeated skeptically. When is the baby due? Soon. A few weeks, maybe. And what will you do then? Do you have a midwife arranged? Do you have, she broke off, seeming to realize that of course Allie's had none of these things. Listen to me, child. When your time comes, you send a word to me, you hear? I've helped birth more Bobbies than I can count. I'll come to you wherever you are. You shouldn't have to go through that alone. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Allie's found herself speechless. Finally she managed, "Thank you. That means more than you know." Marjorie patted her arm. We women have to look after each other. God knows no one else will. She glanced at Edith with approval. You're doing a good thing, taking her in. Not many would. Someone has to, Edith said simply. They parted ways, and Allie's and Edith began the long walk back to the hut, their sacks now lighter from the sold charcoal but heavier with supplies. The walk back seemed even longer than the walk there, and by the time they reached the hut, darkness was falling and Allie's was so tired she could barely stand. She collapsed onto her pallet by the fire while Edith unpacked their purchases and started preparing a meal. As Allie's lay there, feeling the baby moving inside her, she thought about the day, about the small kindnesses she'd encountered, Edith's steadfast support, Marjorie's offer to help with the birth, even the Smiths' neutral acceptance. They were tiny lights in a dark landscape, but they mattered. They were enough to keep hope alive. That night, Edith showed Allie's how to sew baby clothes, teaching her simple stitches, showing her how to fashion tiny gowns from the linen, how to knit small caps and mittens from the wool yarn. It was work that required attention and patience, and Allie's found herself enjoying it, imagining the baby wearing these clothes, imagining holding her child and dressing it in garments made by her own hands. Boy or girl, do you think? Edith asked as she worked her needles, creating a small cap in dark gray wool. I don't know, Allie said. I keep thinking boy, because Thomas always talked about having a son, someone to teach his trade to. But maybe that's just wishful thinking. Either way, I'll love it. Of course you will, Edith said. That's what mothers do. Even when we don't mean to, even when we think we can't, we love our children with a fierceness that defies reason. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling, snow beginning to fall again outside, tapping gently against the walls. Then Edith said something that surprised Allie's. If the baby is a girl, you should name her Catherine. Allie's looked up, startled. Your daughter's name. She'd have liked that. Knowing there was another Catherine in the world, another chance at the life she didn't get to have. Edith's hands didn't stop moving, but her voice was soft. And if it's a boy, well, you'll name him for Thomas, I expect. I will, Allie's confirmed. Thomas after his father. so he'll know who he came from, even if he never knew him. Good, Edith said. Names matter. They're how we remember, how we carry the past forward into the future. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. They couldn't work on charcoal burning. It was too cold, and Allie's was too close to her time. Instead, they focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. Edith showed Allie's how to make a birth chair from rough wood and rope, how to prepare clean clothes for the delivery, and how to brew herbs that might ease labor pains. She explained what would happen, what Allie's should expect, warning her that it would be painful and difficult, but that she would survive it, that women had survived it since the beginning of time. Allie's listened carefully, filing away information, trying not to be afraid. But the truth was, she was terrified. Women died in childbirth all the time. Edith's own daughter had died that way. It was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do, especially without proper care, proper food, proper rest. But there was no avoiding it. The baby would come, ready or not, and Allie's would have to endure whatever came with it. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Edith didn't observe holidays much. Living alone in the forest, she'd gotten out of the habit of marking special days. But Allie's remembered it was Christmas Eve, and she said a quiet prayer for Thomas, for their baby, for Edith, for all the people struggling through this harsh winter. She prayed for mercy, for grace, for just enough luck to get through to spring. On the Feast of the Holy Innocents, 3 days after Christmas, Allie's went into labor. It started in the early morning, just after dawn, with a pain in her back that she initially dismissed as the usual pregnancy aches. But then it came again, stronger, radiating around to her belly, and she knew. The baby was coming. Edith, she called, her voice tight with sudden fear. Edith, I think it's time. The old woman was at her side in an instant, her experienced hands pressing gently on Allie's belly, feeling the tightness there. Yes, she said calmly. It's begun. Don't be afraid. Your body knows what to do. But Allie's was afraid. All the preparation in the world couldn't stop the fear that gripped her as another pain rolled through her, stronger than the last. She thought of Catherine, Edith's daughter, bleeding to death while her baby died in her arms. She thought of all the women she'd known who'd died in childbirth, all the Bobbies who'd never drawn breath, all the ways this could go wrong. I'm going to send it to Marjorie, Edith said. She's a good midwife, and she offered to help. Can you manage alone for a few hours while I fetch her? A few hours, Allie's gasped. How long will this take? Could be hours, could be a day or more. First Bobbies often take their time. But you're young and strong, and the baby feels well positioned. I think you'll do fine. Edith helped Allie's to her feet, walking her slowly around the small hut. Keep moving as long as you can. It helps things progress. I'll be back as quickly as I can. She bundled herself into her cloak and left, and Allie's was alone with her pain and her fear. She walked as Edith had instructed, packing the small space, one hand pressed to her aching back, the other gripping the wall for support. The contractions came in waves, building slowly, cresting, then receding, leaving her breathless and shaking. Time became strange, elastic. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like minutes. She lost track of how long she'd been alone, how many contractions had come and gone. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, not sharp like a cut or a burn, but deep and primal, a force that seemed to come from the earth itself, reminding her that her body was not entirely her own, that nature had claims on her that superseded her will. She found herself talking to Thomas, to his ghost, to the memory of him. "Help me," she whispered. "I need you. Our baby needs you. Please, Thomas, if you can hear me, help us through this." There was no answer, of course. The dead didn't speak, no matter how desperately the living called to them. But talking helped anyway, made her feel less alone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard voices outside, Edith's and Marjorie's. The door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and the two women, snow-covered and breathless from hurrying. "There now, child," Marjorie said, immediately taking charge with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Let's see how you're getting on." She examined Allie's with gentle but efficient hands, nodding to herself. "Good, good. You're doing well. Still a ways to go, but everything feels right. The baby's positioned well, head down like it should be." The reassurance helped and gave Allie something to hold on to. If everything was progressing normally, then maybe she would survive this. Maybe her baby would live. Maybe the story didn't have to end in tragedy. Marjorie and Edith worked together like a well-practiced team, though Allie suspected they'd never actually worked a birth together before. But both women knew what needed doing, and they did it without fuss or drama. They helped Allie's into the birth chair when the pains grew stronger, supported her when she needed to stand and walk, gave her sips of herbal tea that Edith had brewed, something with raspberry leaf and chamomile that was supposed to ease the labor. The afternoon wore on into evening, and still the baby didn't come. The contractions grew stronger, closer together, until Allie's felt like she was drowning in them, barely getting a chance to breathe between waves. She cried out, unable to help herself, gripping Marjorie's hands so hard she must have been bruising the old woman's fingers. "That's it, girl," Marjorie encouraged. "Don't hold back. Scream if you need to. No one here but us, and we've heard it all before." Allie's did scream, great wrenching cries that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere primal and ancient. She understood now why childbirth was called labor. It was work, the hardest work she'd ever done, harder than hauling water or scrubbing floors or tending charcoal pits. This was work that engaged every part of her, body and mind and spirit, demanding everything she had to give and then demanding more. "I can't," she gasped during a brief respite. "I can't do this. It's too much." "You can and you will," Edith said firmly. "Women have been doing this since Eve. You're strong enough. You have to be." And somehow she was. When Marjorie told her to push, she pushed, gathering every scrap of strength and will and channeling it down, bearing down with a force that felt like it might split her in two. Once, twice, 3 times, and then a wail. Thin and reedy but unmistakably alive. Her baby, crying its first breath. "A girl," Marjorie announced, her weathered face breaking into a wide smile. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Allie's barely heard her. She was reaching for her baby, and Marjorie was placing the tiny, bloody, perfect creature on her chest, and Allie's was crying and laughing simultaneously, all the pain forgotten in the rush of overwhelming love that flooded through her. The baby was so small, so impossibly small, with a red, scrunched face and tiny fists that waved in the air. She had dark hair, plastered to her head with birth fluids, and when she opened her eyes for a brief moment, Allie saw they were dark like Thomas's had been. She had his nose too, Allie's thought, that same straight line. "Catherine," Allie's whispered, looking up at Edith through her tears. "Her name is Catherine. If that's still all right." Edith's face did something complicated, a mixture of pain and joy, and something else Allie's couldn't quite name. "It's more than all right," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "It's perfect. Welcome to the world, little Catherine." The work wasn't done yet. There was the afterbirth to deliver, and Allie's to clean and tend, and the baby to wash and wrap. But Marjorie and Edith handled all of it efficiently, while Allie's lay in a daze of exhaustion and joy. Her daughter nestled against her chest, making small, snuffling noises that were the most beautiful sounds Allie's had ever heard. "She's healthy," Marjorie pronounced after examining the baby thoroughly. "Good strong lungs, moves all her limbs well, good color." "You've done well, Allie's. Both of you have." Night had fallen fully by the time everything was settled. Allie's cleaned and dressed in a fresh shift. Catherine wrapped snugly in the soft linen Edith had bought, the hut tidied and warm. Marjorie prepared to leave, refusing any payment Edith tried to offer. "I said I'd help and I did," she said. "That's enough. But Allie's, you listen to me. You rest now as much as you can. Don't try to do too much too soon. Your body needs time to heal. And that baby needs you to be strong and healthy." "I will," Allie's promised. "And thank you. Thank you so much." After Marjorie left, making her way back to Thornbury through the winter night, it was just the 3 of them, Allie's, Edith, and baby Catherine. Allie's tried to nurse the baby, and after a few fumbling attempts, Catherine latched on and began to suckle, her tiny mouth working, her eyes closed in concentration. "Look at her," Allie's marveled. "She knows exactly what to do." "Bobbies are born knowing what they need to survive," Edith said softly. "It's we adults who forget." She was sitting near the fire, her lined face gentle as she watched the baby nurse. "She's beautiful, Allie's. Truly. She is, isn't she?" Allie's couldn't stop looking at her daughter, couldn't stop touching her soft skin, her tiny fingers, marveling at the perfection of her. "Thomas should be here. He should see her. He would have been so proud," Edith said. "Any father would be." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Catherine's small noises as she nursed. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the hut it was warm and safe. And for this moment, for this one precious moment, Alice felt something she hadn't felt in months. Happiness. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. The first few days after Catherine's birth were a blur of sleeplessness and wonder. The baby nursed constantly, slept fitfully, cried for reasons Alice couldn't always decipher. But every time she looked at her daughter's face, every time she felt that small, warm weight in her arms, Alice felt a surge of fierce, protective love that was almost frightening in its intensity. She would do anything for this child, anything. Edith proved invaluable, showing Alice how to change and clean the baby, how to swaddle her tightly to help her sleep, how to recognize the different types of cries: hungry, tired, uncomfortable. The old woman seemed transformed in Catherine's presence, softer somehow, as if the baby had thawed something long frozen inside her. "You're a natural," Edith told Alice on the third day, watching her competently diaper and dress the baby. "Catherine is lucky to have you as her mother." "I'm the lucky one," Alice said. "She's perfect. Everything about her is perfect." But as the days passed and the initial euphoria faded, reality began to reassert itself. Alice's body ached from the birth, healing slowly. She was constantly tired, waking multiple times each night to feed the baby. And the question that had been lurking in the back of her mind could no longer be ignored. What happened next? Edith raised the subject gently one evening as they sat by the fire, Catherine sleeping in Alice's arms. "You'll need to make some decisions soon," she said. "About what you're going to do, where you're going to go." Alice's heart sank. She'd known this was coming, and had known from the beginning that Edith's hospitality had limits. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I know," she said quietly. I don't know what to do. I have no money, no family, no place to go. And now I have Catherine to think about too. Have you given any more thought to the convent I mentioned?" "Zenda. Mary's." "I've thought about it," Alice admitted. "But I'm afraid. What if they won't take us both? What if they make me give her up?" "They might," Edith said honestly. "Or they might take you both but expect you to eventually take vows, become a nun yourself. You'd have to give up any hope of marrying again, of having a normal life." "What's a normal life?" Alice asked with a bitter laugh. "I thought I had one with Thomas in our cottage. Look how that turned out." "Still," Edith pressed, "you should think carefully. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Do you really want to spend it in a convent?" Alice looked down at Catherine, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I want to spend it with my daughter. That's all I know for certain. Everything else, I'll figure it out." But figuring it out proved difficult. The winter continued its harsh grip on the land, and travel was nearly impossible with a newborn. They settled into an uneasy routine. Allie's caring for Catherine, Edith managing the charcoal work alone, both of them stretching their supplies as far as they could. Edith never complained, never made Allie's feel like a burden, but Allie's could see the strain. The food supplies were dwindling, and there was no way to replenish them until the weather cleared enough for Edith to make another trip to Thornbury. Then, in mid-January, about 3 weeks after Catherine's birth, something happened that changed everything. Allie's woke one morning to find Edith still in her pallet, which was unusual. The old woman was normally up before dawn. When Allie's approached, she saw that Edith's face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Edith," Allie's touched her forehead and pulled back quickly. She was burning hot. "How long have you been like this?" "Started last night," Edith managed, her voice weak. "Didn't want to worry you. Thought it would pass." But it didn't pass. Over the next few days, the fever worsened. Edith developed a terrible cough that shook her whole frame, and she was too weak to leave her pallet. Allie's did what she could, brewing the herbs her mother had taught her about. Willow bark for fever, horehound for cough, elderflower for sweating. She kept Edith warm, gave her water and thin broth, and prayed desperately for her recovery. But medieval medicine could only do so much against serious illness, and Allie's was terribly afraid. She couldn't lose Edith. Not now, not when she'd come to depend on her, to care about her, to think of her almost as family. And selfishly, she couldn't afford to lose her. Without Edith, she had nothing. Nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Catherine seemed to sense the tension in the hut, crying more than usual, refusing to settle. Allie's found herself torn between caring for the baby and tending to Edith, trying to do both adequately and feeling like she was failing at everything. On the 4th day of Edith's illness, Allie's made a decision. She bundled Catherine carefully into layers of cloth and linen, wrapped herself in her cloak, and set out for Thornbury. It was foolish, probably dangerous. The baby was so young, the weather so cold, but she had no choice. Edith needed help beyond what Allie's could provide. The walk that had taken 3 hours before now took more than 5, with Allie stopping frequently to check on Catherine, to adjust her wrappings, to rest her exhausted body. The baby cried from the cold, and Allie's held her close, trying to use her own body heat to keep her warm, praying they would make it before something terrible happened. When she finally stumbled into Thornbury, people stared at her, the desperate-looking woman with a tiny baby, both of them frost-covered and clearly in distress. Allie's went straight to Marjorie's cottage and pounded on the door. The old washerwoman opened it, took one look at Allie's and Catherine, and pulled them inside. "Sweet Mary, child, what are you doing out in this weather with a newborn?" "It's Edith," Allie's gasped. "Oh, she's sick. Very sick. I've done everything I know how to do, but she's not getting better. She needs help. Please." Marjorie didn't hesitate. She gathered supplies, more herbs, clean cloths, a jar of honey, and within an hour she and Allie's were making the trek back to the forest hut, with Marjorie carrying most of the supplies and Allie's carrying Catherine. When they reached the hut, Edith was worse. The fever had spiked higher, and she was barely conscious, mumbling things that made no sense. Marjorie examined her carefully, her face grave. "It's lung fever," she pronounced. "Bad, but not necessarily fatal if we can get the fever down and keep her breathing clear." She set to work immediately, brewing stronger remedies, applying poultices to Edith's chest, using all her accumulated knowledge and experience. Alice watched helplessly, holding Catherine, feeling utterly useless. This was her fault, she thought. If she hadn't been here, Edith wouldn't have been working so hard, stretching her resources so thin, weakening herself. If Alice had just frozen in the woods that first night instead of knocking on Edith's door, the old woman would be fine now. "Stop that," Marjorie said sharply, as if reading her thoughts. "I can see you blaming yourself." "Don't. Illness comes when it comes. Edith's been living alone out here for years, managing just fine. This isn't your fault." But it felt like her fault. Everything felt like her fault, Thomas's death, because maybe if she'd noticed something sooner, gotten him help faster, Catherine being born into poverty and uncertainty, Edith getting sick. She was a curse, she thought miserably. Everyone who helped her suffered for it. Marjorie stayed for 3 days, tending Edith day and night, refusing to leave until she was certain the crisis had passed. And slowly, painfully slowly, Edith began to improve. The fever broke on the second night, soaking her palate with sweat but leaving her weaker but clearer headed. Her cough improved, becoming less frequent and less violent. By the 3rd day, she was able to sit up and take some broth. "You're a stubborn old woman," Marjorie told her with obvious affection. "I'll give you that." "Takes one to know one," Edith rasped, but there was a hint of her old humor in it. Before Marjorie left to return to Thornbury, she pulled Alice aside. "She needs proper rest and good food to fully recover," she said quietly. "Can you manage that?" "I'll try," Alice said. "I'll do whatever it takes." "I know you will. You're a good girl, Alice. Life has dealt you some hard hands, but you keep playing. That takes courage." She paused, seeming to be considering something. "Listen, I've been thinking. When Edith's well enough to be left alone for a few days, you should come stay with me in the village. Bring the baby. I could use help with my washing work and you could earn a bit of money, save up toward whatever comes next. It's not a permanent solution, but it might buy you some time." The offer was unexpected and generous, and Alice felt tears prick her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Marjorie's weathered face softened. "Because I was you once, many years ago. Widowed young with a baby, no prospects. Someone helped me, old Dame Alice, long dead now, and that help made all the difference. We women have to look after each other, Alice. The world's hard enough without us turning on each other." After Marjorie left, Alice threw herself into caring for both Edith and Catherine. It was exhausting work. The baby needed constant attention, and Edith, though improving, was still very weak and needed help with everything. But Alice found she didn't mind the exhaustion. It gave her purpose, made her feel useful, kept her from dwelling too much on her fears about the future. Edith recovered slowly, gaining strength day by day. 2 weeks after her fever broke, she was able to walk around the hut without assistance. 3 weeks later, she could venture outside for short periods. But the illness had taken its toll. She tired easily now, and her cough, though much improved, never fully went away. "I'm getting old," she admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. Catherine was nursing, making small, contented sounds, and Edith watched them with a wistful expression. "I never minded it before. Getting old, I mean. It seemed natural enough, but now I find myself wishing for just a bit more time." "More time for what?" Alice asked gently. "To see how your story turns out. To watch little Catherine grow, at least for a while. To know that you'll both be all right." She paused. "You've become like family to me, Alice. I didn't expect that when I let you in that night. I thought I'd help you for a few days and send you on your way. But somehow you worked your way in here." She touched her chest over her heart. Alice felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You saved my life. Both our lives. I'll never forget that." "And you saved mine," Edith countered. "If you hadn't gone for Marjorie, I'd have died alone in this hut, and no one would have found me until spring. We're even, I'd say." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Alice thought about family, about how it could be chosen as well as born into. Edith wasn't her mother, but she'd shown her more maternal care than some actual mothers showed their daughters. And Marjorie, too, had been like an aunt or grandmother, appearing at crucial moments with help and wisdom. Maybe that was how you survived in medieval England when you had no family, no husband, no traditional support structure. You built your own family from the people who showed you kindness, from the connections you made, from the grace you found in unexpected places. In February, when Edith was strong enough to be left for a few days, and the weather had cleared enough to make travel possible, Alice took Marjorie up on her offer. She bundled Catherine carefully and made the trek to Thornbury, where Marjorie welcomed them into her small cottage. The work was hard, washing clothes in the icy river, hauling heavy wet fabric, scrubbing stains until her hands were raw. But Alice attacked it with determination. Every coin she earned was a coin toward survival, toward maybe eventually being able to afford a room somewhere, toward some kind of future she could barely imagine. Catherine charmed everyone she met. The village women who brought their washing to Marjorie couldn't help but coo over the baby, commenting on her dark eyes, her sweet temperament, her tiny, perfect fingers. Even the women who'd turned Alice away when she was pregnant found themselves softening in the presence of this innocent child. "She's a beauty," the baker's wife Margaret said, holding Catherine while Alice worked on a particularly stubborn stain. "Looks like her father, you said." "Yes," Alice replied. "She has Thomas's eyes, his nose." "He'd be proud," Margaret said softly. "Any man would be proud of such a daughter." The acceptance she'd been denied while pregnant was slowly, tentatively being offered now that the baby was born. It wasn't complete. There were still whispers, still people who avoided her, but it was something. And Alice learned to take what she could get, to be grateful for small mercies. She worked for Marjorie for a week, then returned to Edith's hut with enough money to buy food supplies and a few necessities for Catherine, who was growing rapidly and constantly needed new wrappings and clothes. The cycle repeated, a week or two at the hut, then a week in town working for Marjorie. It wasn't sustainable long term, but it was working for now, getting them through the hardest part of winter. March arrived with the first hints of spring, longer days, slightly warmer temperatures, buds beginning to form on the trees. Catherine was 2 months old now, more alert, beginning to smile, her personality emerging. She was a quiet baby, watchful, with an intensity in her gaze that reminded Alice of Edith. One evening, as they sat by the fire watching Catherine try to grab her own toes, Edith said, "You should think about the future, Alice. Real plans, not just getting by week to week." "I am thinking about it," Alice said. "I'm saving what I can. Maybe by summer, I'll have enough to rent a room in Thornbury and find more permanent work. And who'll care for Catherine while you work?" It was the question Alice had been avoiding. She couldn't work and care for a baby at the same time, but she couldn't afford to pay someone else to watch her. It was an impossible problem with no good solutions. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'll figure something out." But Edith had a suggestion. "What if you stayed here? With me, I mean. Permanently." Alice looked up, startled. "What?" "Hear me out," Edith said. "I'm not getting any younger, and this winter proved I'm not as strong as I used to be. I need help with the charcoal burning, real help, consistent help. You've learned the trade, you're good at it. We could be partners, split the profits such as they are. It's not much, but it's enough for 2 people to survive on, maybe even 3 if we're careful." "You mean live here in this hut? All 3 of us?" "Why not? It's not a palace, but it's weatherproof and warm. There's room enough. And Catherine could grow up here in the forest. It's a good place for a child, actually. Safe, away from the troubles of the village, plenty of space to run and play when she's older." Alice's mind reeled. She'd been so focused on getting back to conventional life, a room in a village, normal work, being part of society again, that she hadn't considered there might be other options. Living in the forest, making charcoal, raising her daughter away from the judgmental eyes of villagers who would always see her as the cursed widow. It wasn't what she'd imagined for herself. But then, nothing about her life had turned out as imagined. "Think about it," Edith said. "You don't have to decide right now. But it's an option. A real option, not just a temporary solution." That night, Alice lay awake long after Edith and Catherine had fallen asleep, thinking. What did she really want? She'd loved her life with Thomas, in their cottage, being part of the village community. But that life was gone, and it wasn't coming back. She could chase after a shadow of it, trying to recreate something similar, Or she could accept that her life had taken a different path and make the best of where she actually was. Living here with Edith wouldn't be easy. The work was hard, the isolation could be challenging, and raising Catherine in the forest came with its own dangers. But there would also be freedom, freedom from gossip, from the rigid social hierarchies of village life, from the constant need to prove herself acceptable to people who'd already decided she wasn't. And there was something else, something harder to name. She'd come to love this place, the quiet of the forest, the simple satisfaction of tending the charcoal pits, the intimacy of the small hut shared with someone who understood loss and survival. She'd come to love Edith, this fierce, practical, kind woman who'd taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. Why should she leave that chase after something uncertain when she already had something real right here? In the morning, she told Edith her decision. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll stay. We'll be partners. And if you'll have us, this will be Catherine's home." Edith's smile was like sunrise breaking over winter hills. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." And so a new chapter began. Alice and Edith worked together to improve the hut, adding a small linta for additional sleeping space, building a better cradle for Catherine, making the space more suitable for 3 people instead of 1. As spring progressed and the weather warmed, they prepared and lit a new charcoal pit, working side by side, Alice carrying Catherine in a sling on her back while she tended the fires. The work was hard, but Alice had learned that hard work was better than the alternative, charity that came with strings attached, pity that made her feel small, the constant uncertainty of depending on others' goodwill. Here she was earning her keep, contributing equally, building something. Word spread slowly through Thornbury that Thomas's widow had partnered with old Edith, that they were living in the forest hut, raising the baby there. People had opinions, of course. It was scandalous, it was unsuitable, it was odd. But as the months passed and Alice and Edith continued to produce good charcoal, continued to pay their fees to the Lord's Reeve, continued to manage their lives competently, the scandal faded into simply being one more strange fact about the world, no more remarkable than old William's blindness or young Thomas having become a monk. Catherine thrived in the forest. She was a healthy, happy baby, growing strong on her mother's milk and the fresh air. When she was old enough to sit up, Alice would place her on a blanket near the charcoal pits while she worked, and Catherine would watch the smoke curling into the sky with fascinated eyes, reaching toward it with chubby hands. Summer came, then autumn, then another winter, this one less harsh than the last, and made easier by the fact that they were prepared, had adequate supplies, and had each other. Catherine learned to crawl, then to walk, taking her first steps in the clearing behind the hut, while Alice and Edith cheered her on. The plague that Edith had heard whispers about that first winter finally reached their region in the spring of 1349. It swept through Thornbury and the surrounding villages with devastating speed, killing young and old, rich and poor, the pious and the sinful with equal indifference. Father Benedict died. The blacksmith Hugh died. Master Oswin the Thatcher died, and his nephew who'd taken Thomas's cottage. Old Marjorie survived, but lost 2 of her sons who lived in neighboring villages. The forest hut was spared. Isolated, away from the main routes of infection, visited by few people, Alice and Edith and Catherine remained healthy while the world around them died. They knew they were lucky, knew that luck was arbitrary and meaningless, knew that survival was often just a matter of random chance rather than any particular virtue. But they were grateful nonetheless. When the plague finally burned itself out, the world that remained was different. There were fewer people, which meant more opportunities for those who survived. Labor was suddenly valuable, and even women found they could command better terms for their work. The old rigid social structure had been shaken, and in the cracks and spaces, people like Alice found room to breathe, to build lives that wouldn't have been possible before. Through it all, Catherine grew. She learned to talk, calling Alice Mama and Edith Grandmama, though they were not related by blood. She learned the forest the way children learn their first language, naturally, instinctively, until she could identify every tree, every bird call, every safe path and dangerous spot. She learned the charcoal burner's trade, helping in small ways at first, gathering kindling, watching the smoke, and then in larger ways as she grew older and more capable. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when Catherine was asleep and the 2 women sat by the fire, Alice would think back to that desperate winter of 1347, to the girl she'd been pregnant, homeless, terrified, certain she would die. She thought about the journey from that girl to this woman she'd become. Harder, yes, but also stronger. More confident, more capable. Still carrying grief for Thomas, still missing the life they should have had, but no longer defined solely by that loss. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Edith one such evening. "Taking me in that night. It changed your whole life." Edith considered the question seriously, as she considered most things. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. You gave me back something I'd lost when Catherine died, purpose beyond just surviving. A reason to keep going, to plan for more than just the next season. And you gave me a granddaughter," she smiled. "Even if she's not mine by blood, she's mine by choice. That counts for something, I think." "It counts for everything," Alice said softly. Years passed. Catherine grew from toddler to child to young girl, wild and free and happy in the forest. Edith grew older but remained strong, her cough never quite leaving but never quite defeating her either. Alice grew into her role, mother, charcoal burner, forest dweller, survivor. She never remarried, though there were occasional offers from men who'd lost wives in the plague and needed someone to keep their houses and raise their children. But she'd built a life she was content with, and she had no desire to risk it for the uncertainty of marriage to men she barely knew. The forest became her home in a way Thornberry never had been. She learned its secrets, its rhythms, its moods. She learned to read weather in the behavior of birds, to find healing herbs in unlikely places, to feel the pulse of the seasons in her bones. She taught these things to Catherine, passing down knowledge the way it had been passed to her, an unbroken chain reaching back through generations of women who'd survived by paying attention, by learning, by adapting. When Catherine was 7 years old, Alice began teaching her to read. She remembered what Edith had said about her daughter's desire for learning, and she wanted to give Catherine every advantage, every skill that might help her in life. They borrowed a psalter from Father Benedict's replacement, a young priest named Father William, who was more flexible than his predecessor had been. And Alice taught Catherine her letters the same way Thomas had taught her, slowly, patiently, until words that had been mysterious symbols became familiar friends. "Why do I need to read?" Catherine asked one day, struggling with a particularly difficult passage. "Because knowledge is power," Alice told her. "Because the world is changing, and the women who survive and thrive will be the ones who can adapt, who can learn, who can do more than one thing. You're learning charcoal burning from me and Grandmama Edith, but you should also learn letters, numbers, and anything else we can teach you. The more you know, the more choices you'll have." Catherine absorbed this lesson, along with countless others. She was a bright child, curious and determined, with her father's steadiness and her mother's resilience. Watching her grow, Alice sometimes felt a bittersweet ache. Thomas should be here to see this, to know his daughter to guide her. But then she'd remember that if Thomas had lived, Catherine might have been just one of several children, might have grown up in a conventional village household with conventional expectations. This life, unconventional as it was, had given Catherine freedoms and opportunities she might not have had otherwise. It wasn't the life Alice had imagined for herself or her daughter. But it was a good life, built from ruins, forged in winter's coldest depths, sustained by the kindness of women who understood survival. It was a life worth living, worth fighting for, worth celebrating. On Catherine's 10th birthday, Alice and Edith gave her a gift they'd been planning for months, a wooden comb, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and acorns. Edith had done the carving during the long winter evenings, her gnarled fingers still nimble enough for fine work when she took her time. Alice had polished it smooth with sand and oil until it gleamed like honey in the firelight. "It's beautiful," Catherine breathed, running her fingers over the carved patterns. "Did you make this, Grandmama?" "I did," Edith said, her voice warm with pride. "Every woman should have something that's hers alone, something beautiful that reminds her of her worth. Your mother has one that your father made for her. Now you have one too." Catherine hugged them both fiercely, and Alice felt tears prick her eyes. 10 years. 10 years since that desperate winter night when she'd knocked on this door, pregnant and homeless, and certain she would die. 10 years of building a life from nothing, of learning that family was made as much as born, that home was wherever you chose to plant roots. That summer, Edith's cough worsened again. She tried to hide it to keep working as she always had, but Alice and Catherine both noticed. They took over more of the heavy work, insisting Edith rest, but the old woman was stubborn. "I'm not dead yet," she said irritably when Alice tried to get her to lie down one afternoon. I can still tend a charcoal pit as well as anyone. No one's saying you can't, Alice replied gently. We're just saying you don't have to do it all yourself anymore. Let us help. That's what family does. Edith's expression softened at the word family. I suppose you're right, she admitted. Though it galls me to slow down. You've earned the right to slow down, Alice said. You've worked harder and longer than most people ever will. Let yourself rest. By autumn, it was clear that Edith was failing. The cough had settled deep in her lungs, and she'd grown thin despite Alice's best efforts to feed her nourishing broths and stews. She tired easily, slept most of the day, and when she was awake, she often seemed to be somewhere else, lost in memories. One evening in late October, with the first frost sparkling on the ground outside and a good fire burning in the hearth, Edith called Alice and Catherine to her bedside. She looked small and frail, a shadow of the formidable woman who'd opened her door to a desperate stranger 3 years ago. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice thin but clear. About the hut and the charcoal burning rites. Edith, you don't need to, Alice began, but Edith cut her off with a raised hand. Hush, child. Let me speak while I can. She took a wheezing breath. This hut, this plot of forest, I've had the rights to it for 25 years, paid up through next spring. When I'm gone, those rights transfer. I've made arrangements with Lord Aelred's reeve. He knows you, knows you're capable. The rights will pass to you, Alice. You'll be the charcoal burner here, officially. You'll pay the annual fee, and the hut and the work will be yours. You did that for me, Alice asked, her voice breaking. For you and for Catherine, Edith confirmed. You need security. You need a place that's legally yours, work that's recognized. I couldn't let you go back to wandering, to uncertainty. You've built something here. You deserve to keep it. Alice took Edith's withered hand in both of hers. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For saving my life, for teaching me, for being the mother I lost. And you were the daughter I lost, Edith said softly. Her eyes moved to Catherine, who was sitting quietly, tears running down her young face. Come here, little one. Catherine climbed onto the pallet carefully, mindful of Edith's fragility. Edith stroked her hair with a trembling hand. You are good for your mama, she said. Learn everything you can. Be strong, but also be kind. The world needs more women who know how to be both. I will, Grandmama, Catherine promised. I will. Edith died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep, with Alice holding one hand and Catherine holding the other. They buried her in the forest she'd loved, beneath an ancient oak tree, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross that Alice carved with Edith's name and the years of her life. It wasn't much of a marker, but it was honest, and Edith had always valued honesty above ornamentation. The grief was profound but not paralyzing. Alice had learned, through Thomas's death and the hard years that followed, that grief and life could coexist, that you could mourn deeply while still moving forward. She and Catherine mourned Edith properly, crying when they needed to, sharing memories, honoring her by continuing the work she'd taught them. True to Edith's word, Lord Aelred's reeve recognized Allie's claim to the hut and the charcoal burning rights. She paid the annual fee, now within her means after 3 years of careful saving, and received the official documentation that made her a recognized tenant, with legal rights to the land and the work. It was a strange feeling, being official, being documented, being recognized by the system that had once cast her out. But it was also empowering. She was no longer a homeless widow dependent on charity. She was Allie's the charcoal burner, tenant of Lord Aelred, mother of Catherine, owner of her own small piece of the world. The years that followed were good ones. Catherine grew tall and capable, mastering the charcoal trade while also pursuing her education. Father William, impressed by her intelligence and dedication, taught her not just reading but also basic mathematics and some Latin. She became known in Thornbury as the charcoal burner's daughter who could read, which was remarkable enough to be notable but not so remarkable as to be threatening. When Catherine turned 14, young men began to notice her. She'd grown into a striking young woman, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's resilient spirit. Several boys from the village began finding excuses to walk past the forest hut, to engage her in conversation at the market, to make their interest known. Allie's watched this with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted Catherine to marry well, to have an easier life than Allie's had had. But another part feared losing her, feared that marriage would take her daughter away, and would undo the life they'd built together. "What do you want?" she asked Catherine one evening. "When you think about your future, what do you see?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I like our life here. I like work, the forest, and freedom. But I also wonder what else is out there, what other kinds of lives are possible." She looked at her mother. "Did you feel that way when you were my age?" "I did," Allie's admitted. "And then I met your father and I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. A husband, a home, children, a simple life. And I was happy with that choice, truly happy. But then he died and everything changed, and I had to figure out how to want different things, build a different life." "Do you still miss him?" Catherine asked softly. "Every day," Allie said. "But it's a different kind of missing now. Not the sharp, desperate grief of the early days, but a gentler ache, like an old injury that twinges in cold weather. He'll always be part of me, part of you. But life goes on, and that's not a betrayal of him. That's honoring what he would have wanted for us." Catherine nodded slowly, absorbing this. "I don't want to rush into anything," she said. "I want to choose carefully, know what I'm choosing and why. You've taught me that I have choices, that I don't have to follow the expected path if it doesn't suit me." "You do have choices," Allie's confirmed. "More than I did at your age. The plague changed things, made the world more flexible. Women have more options now. You could marry, or you could continue working here with me. You could learn another trade, move to a city, even petition to join a guild if you were determined enough. The world is still hard, especially for women, but there are cracks in the old walls now. Ways through that didn't exist before. In the end, Catherine chose to stay, not forever necessarily, but for now. She took over more of the charcoal work as Allie's grew older, their roles gradually revering until it was Catherine doing the heavy labor and Allie's providing guidance and wisdom. Several young men courted her over the years, but none quite captured her heart until she was 20, when a traveling carpenter named Robert came through Thornbury and stayed. Robert was different from the local boys, more worldly, having worked in Bristol and even once in London. He could read and cipher, had opinions about politics and religion, and most importantly, he respected Catherine's intelligence and independence. When he asked her to marry him, he made it clear that he'd be willing to live in the forest hut, to help with the charcoal work, to become part of their unconventional household, rather than expecting Catherine to abandon everything and conform to a traditional arrangement. Allie's liked him and saw echoes of Thomas in his quiet competence and gentle humor. When Catherine asked for her blessing, she gave it gladly. They married in the spring of 1358 in the little church in Thornbury, with half the village attending out of curiosity and affection. Catherine was radiant in a dress of green wool that Allie's had spent months sewing, with wildflowers woven into her dark hair. Allie stood beside her daughter, feeling the weight of all the years between that desperate winter and this joyful spring, marveling at how life could transform, how hope could survive even the cruelest seasons. Robert proved to be everything he'd promised: a good husband, a capable worker, a kind stepson-in-law to Allie's. He built an extension onto the hut, creating separate spaces for the generations to live together while maintaining some privacy. He learned charcoal burning and proved to have a knack for it, bringing new ideas and efficiencies that improved their productivity. And when Catherine became pregnant 2 years after their marriage, he was as devoted and protective as any husband could be. The birth of Allie's grandson, they named him Thomas after his grandfather, brought a full circle quality to Allie's life that she hadn't expected. Holding this small boy, this continuation of the line she'd feared would end in that harsh winter of 1347, Allie's felt something shift inside her. She'd survived. More than that, she'd built something that would outlast her. Her daughter was happy and settled. Her grandson would grow up knowing stories about his grandfather Thomas and his great-grandmother Edith, would learn the charcoal trade, would carry forward the legacy of survival and resilience. 3 years later, Catherine had a daughter, whom they named Agnes after Allie's mother. And 2 years after that, another son, whom they called Edmund after the kind blacksmith's apprentice, who'd once given Allie's roasted chestnuts when she was homeless and freezing. Allie's grew older, her hair turning gray, her hands developing the same gnarled quality Edith's had had. She worked less and less, spending more time with her grandchildren, teaching them the forest lore she'd learned, telling them stories about their ancestors, about the grandmother they'd never met who'd had such courage and determination. Sometimes she would walk to Edith's grave beneath the old oak tree and sit there quietly, talking to the memory of her friend, updating her on Catherine's life, on the grandchildren, on the way the forest changed with each season yet remained fundamentally itself. She'd tell Edith about the young woman Catherine had become, how she'd inherited Edith's practical wisdom and Allie's determination, and Thomas's steady character, combining them all into something uniquely her own. "You'd be so proud," Allie's would say to the grave, to the spirit she imagined listening. "She's everything we hoped she'd be, and more. Thank you for giving us the chance to find out." In the spring of 1368, 21 years after that desperate winter that had changed everything, Allie's fell ill. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow fadding, a gradual weakening, her body finally deciding it had worked hard enough, endured enough, earned its rest. She was 50 years old, which was a good age for someone of her class and circumstances, longer than many lived. Catherine tended her with the same devoted care Allie's had shown Edith years before. Robert kept the charcoal work going. The grandchildren brought her wildflowers and sat beside her bed, their young voices bringing light into the dimness. On her last day, Allie's asked Catherine to open the small wooden box where she kept her few treasures. Inside was the wooden comb Thomas had carved for her all those years ago, worn smooth from decades of use, but still bearing traces of the flowers he'd etched into it. There was also a small scrap of fabric from Thomas's shirt, saved from when she'd had to sell nearly everything. A pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. A small stone Catherine had given her when she was 3, declaring it was pretty like Mama. "These are yours now," Allie's told Catherine. "Keep them or pass them on as you see fit. They're just things, but they're also memories, pieces of all the people we've loved and lost." "I'll treasure them," Catherine promised, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, Hush," Allie said gently, echoing words Edith had once said to her. "Don't grieve too much. I've had a good life, better than I had any right to expect after Thomas died. I was happy. That's more than most people can say." That night, Allie's dreamed of Thomas. He was young again, as he'd been when they married, standing in a sunlit meadow with his hand outstretched toward her. And behind him, dimmer but still present, she could see Edith and her mother Agnes, and all the people she'd loved and lost, waiting patiently. She woke once more, just before dawn, to see Catherine sleeping in a chair beside her bed, exhausted from the long vigil. The early light was filtering through the gaps in the walls, making everything look soft and golden. From the other room, she could hear the sounds of her grandchildren stirring, beginning their day. Allie's closed her eyes, content. She'd started with nothing, pregnant, homeless, terrified in the cruelest season. She'd ended with everything that mattered. A daughter who thrived, grandchildren who would carry her story forward. A life that had meant something, that had made a difference in the world, however small. Winter had not defeated her. She'd endured, adapted, survived, and ultimately thrived. And in doing so, she'd proven something important about the human spirit. That even in the darkest times, Even when fortune seemed to have abandoned you completely, there was still hope, still a possibility, still the chance that kindness would find you in the forest, that strangers would become family, that endings could transform into beginnings. As dawn broke fully over the forest, painting the world in shades of gold and green, Alice let go. She slipped away peacefully, her work complete, her legacy secure, her story told. Catherine found her an hour later and wept as she needed to weep, mourning the mother who'd been her rock, her teacher, her first example of what strength looked like. But even through her tears, Catherine knew that Alice would not have wanted her to despair. She'd taught Catherine, by example more than words, that loss was survivable, that grief could coexist with joy, that life insisted on continuing even when it seemed impossible. They buried Alice beside Edith, beneath the same ancient oak tree, two women who'd chosen each other, who'd built family from friendship, who'd proven that love and loyalty didn't require blood relation to be real and lasting. In the years that followed, Catherine would tell her children stories about their grandmother Alice and their great-great-grandmother Edith. She'd tell them about the winter of 1347, when Alice had been pregnant and homeless and had found refuge in the forest. She'd tell them about the charcoal burning trade, about survival and resilience, about the importance of kindness to strangers, because you never knew when you might become the stranger in need. And young Thomas, as he grew older and eventually took over the charcoal work himself, would tell these stories to his children, and they to theirs, until the details blurred and shifted, but the essential truth remained, that his great-grandmother had survived impossible circumstances, had built a life from ruins, had proven that winter, no matter how cruel, eventually gave way to spring. The forest remained, as forests do, outlasting individual lives while sheltering the stories they contained. The oak tree where Alice and Edith were buried grew larger, its roots spreading deep, its branches reaching high, a living memorial to two women who'd understood that survival was an act of courage, and that the greatest legacy was not wealth or status, but the love and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Centuries later, when the medieval world was long gone, and the village of Thornbury had grown into something unrecognizable, when the old forest had been mostly cleared for farmland, and the craft of charcoal burning had faded into history, there would still be an old oak tree standing in what remained of the woods. And if you knew where to look, you might find two worn stones beneath it, their inscriptions long since weathered away, but their presence still marking the spot where two women rested, their stories woven into the land itself. And perhaps, on winter nights when the wind howled cold and cruel, when someone somewhere was facing impossible circumstances and couldn't imagine how they'd survive until morning, the spirits of Alice and Edith would whisper what they'd learned through their own harsh seasons. Endure. Adapt, accept kindness when it comes. Offer it when you can. Build a family where you find it. And remember, winter is cruel, but it always ends. Spring comes again. Life continues. Hope survives. The end. May you sleep peacefully, dear friend, knowing that even in our darkest winters, the human spirit finds ways to endure, to hope, to love, and ultimately to prevail. Rest well.